Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, Episode 2, featuring Emmanuel Acho, the host, and Matthew McConaughey. If you didn't have a chance to watch that, go back and watch that now. I find it incredibly informative and thoughtful discussion. Now, as we discussed, the standard focus is diversity, uh, and I think the Emmanuel Acho video is great about getting people to think through that stuff, as well as fighting individual bias, pushing the individual to do the right thing, to catch themselves. The way he calls out Matthew McConaughey on have you thought about your hiring practices is I think a pretty stark one. And I actually want to stop there, though, because I want to talk about the additional frame, the other way to think about diversity and inclusion in just a sec. But just first, I want to think about how to master this one. How is it that we talk about individual and ethical concerns around diversity and inclusion in a way that is thoughtful and responsible? And I think Matthew McConaughey's response, it would have been really easy for McConaughey to get defensive, to say, "Oh, I have a very diverse staff. I have, to push back and say, well, I've looked for more diverse people, but I can't find them. The talent pool isn't as rich as we would hope." I've heard all of these things mentioned in response to diversity across all of the academic places that I've been, both as employers and as places of academic discussion. But that's not what he does. He sits quietly and thoughtfully and says very little in immediate, really nothing in immediate response, and let's Acho ask the question and leave it there, and is really open to hearing the criticism. And I think that that's just a really important skill that he exhibits there. And certainly when we talk about business communication, that ability to take criticism and sit and think about it and sit with it is a really important one in general, and especially around touchy or sensitive topics such as diversity and inclusion. Then it becomes especially important to be able to take that feedback thoughtfully. Now, that's not what a lot of people do in response to discussions around diversity and inclusion. And I think it's fair to say, and I say this as a white person, I think it's fair to say that white people are especially bad at having these conversations. So I want to encourage you to think about a different way of, well, first of all, a critique of the way that white people in particular, often bring in approaches of diversity and inclusion. And that's in the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Now, I know you're all very busy and you may not have time to read the entire book. And if that's the case, or if you just want to know more what it's about before you commit to picking up another book, there's an excellent review in The New Yorker by a woman named Katie Waldman. And I've put the link for that in the slide notes for the PowerPoint here. And I'm going to read you a little bit from what Waldman says, because I think it's an excellent summary of the book. She says, in a new book, White Fragility, DiAngelo attempts to explicate the phenomenon of white people's paper-thin skin. She argues that our largely segregated society is set up to insulate whites from racial discomfort so that they fall to pieces at the first application of stress, such as, for instance, when someone suggests that flesh-toned may not be an appropriate name for a beige crayon. Unused to unpleasantness, more than unused to it, racial hierarchies tell white people that they are entitled to peace and deference. They lack the, quote, racial stamina to engage in difficult conversations. This leads them to respond to racial triggers that show dear white people, the term white people, with emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, DiAngelo writes, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-inducing situation. This is a place where white people, myself included, need to be more culturally nimble. Now, that last sentence is, again, from Katie Waldman, but it's true of me as well, right? This is a place where white people, myself, me, Professor Herman, included, need to be more culturally nimble. The ability to take criticism and to discuss uncomfortable topics are just core business communication skills. And so if you can do that in the context of racial inequity, racial tension or discomfort, then virtually any other area in a business environment will also be an area where you're reasonably good at hearing critical feedback on sensitive issues, where you're reasonably good at talking about sensitive issues, and if you can bring that skill set from this touchiest of touchy topics into the rest of your work life, you'll really be setting yourself up for success as a professional in the future. So what's our goal here in talking about white fragility? It's to get to know these conversations and build more flexibility, to read more, to learn more, to ask questions, and to be prepared to hear uncomfortable answers. That doesn't mean you have to know the right way to respond, but it means you have to be willing to admit and accept that you may have said or done or something that is not right, or that you just may not know other people's experiences well enough to be able to speak to that in a credible and meaningful way. Which is not to say that any particular conversation around this topic means that you will necessarily be wrong, or that any concern or question is necessarily invalid. But you have to be is necessarily valid. But you have to be willing to hear the criticism and not lash out and not shut down. That's just an important skill that's important around this topic. And so I urge you to read up on this stuff, think about this stuff, have more of these conversations, and build more flexibility around this. So that's necessary. That's an important part of building the skill set, is understanding the individual and ethical frame around diversity and inclusion. But I also urge you to think about an additional frame or an additional way to think about this stuff that I think is in a lot of ways a much more productive way to think about that. Right? The systemic and business model frame is that other way, which is to say, instead of just thinking about diversity, how many people who don't look like you are there in the workplace or in an educational setting or so on, start thinking about inclusion. Are those people able to bring their full selves to the workplace, and are not only you contributing to that, but is everyone in the office contributing to a place where everyone feels like they can be themselves in the workplace? Instead of fighting individual bias, I want you to think about, how do we also fight systemic bias? There are lots of ways that bias is built into a system in a way that it doesn't take individual racial malice or prejudice to lead to disadvantage for people, or gender malice, or sexism. It doesn't take explicit ideological sexism or anti-LGBTQ attitudes for people who are less advantaged to sometimes be discriminated against within the context of a system. And we have to think about the way that we set up systems such that those biases are baked into them. And we have to go further, really, and build in systemic anti-bias. There are a whole lot of ways to do this. I could talk for a whole semester about ways to do this. We have an inclusion and diversity course in the management department. That's one of the upper division management electives, taught by Professor William Carnes. I'd urge you all, if you're interested in this, to talk to him, or to consider even taking that class. And here's the one I will elaborate on a little bit, though, which is that the more inclusive and the more diverse and the more systemically, the more we build correct systems around this stuff such that we have a truly inclusive office environment, the more profitable our enterprise will truly be. In other words, what I'm encouraging you to adopt is the frame explained in a lot of detail by a book by Mark Kaplan and Mason Donovan called The Inclusion Dividend: Why Investing in Diversity and Inclusion Pays Off. The premise of this book is that a good diversity and inclusion strategy takes investment up front, but it creates greater profits over time. In other words, good diversity and inclusion strategy pays. I want to talk about performance by diversity quartile. This is evidence provided by the they're interested in is the bottom line and making money. They're very sort of mainstream capitalist-focused consulting company, and what they've found is pretty stark, actually. So among companies that are in the bottom quartile for diversity, for either gender or race and ethnicity, they're more likely than not to underperform the industry median, right? They have less than 50% chances of outperforming their industry median. and those at the top quartile for diversity have an over 50% chance of outperforming their industry median. So within an industry, sector by sector, the more diversity we have within those companies, and this is among, keep in mind, this is among the executive team, and then it's not just who's diverse in the building, but who's diverse and that is strongly correlated with more likely to be being profitable. And this is despite all of the other things that can affect a company. So this is a really, in social science terms, this is a really huge effect. And so how does diversity and inclusion help profits? Right, that's an important question. I'm going to go over several of the reasons briefly. First is we get reduced compliance and public relations headaches. This is a picture of Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, who, if you talk to HR scholars and people who know a lot about human relations management, Kalanick is a great example of how not to behave. There have been a lot of problems with people detailing sexual harassment. At one point, stations, and their main competitor, Lyft, has actually seen a substantial increase in their business every time there's been a bad public relations story for Uber. And I know several people who specifically avoid Uber largely because of these sorts of concerns with this company. Second is talent management. Now, the main manager promoted to the next is safety is really valuable in explaining why some people feel really comfortable at work because the workplace sets up a safe environment where people feel like they can take risks, and that's true regardless of why psychological safety is not present. Third is talent acquisition. Now, not every industry can afford to be like almost anything talent and not losing talent. That your diversity and inclusion strategy be built really thoughtfully, but to acquire talent team. And so one might think, sure, great, 4 white guys, mid-century sales team, that's the norm. But here's a picture of a sales team from the recent past. White, increasingly diverse market, so the people and maintain your position in the marketplace. I've got a couple of great TED Talks linked in here. One by Rocio Lorenzo. Topic, as you can tell by my fortunately, and profitable. So we'll pick it up on chapter 3.